I have the utmost pleasure to present to you Professor Jørgen Carling from PRIO, who brought to THEMIS the special expertise of working in the area of migration aspirations and the involuntary immobility. But I would like to begin with asking, what is the area of THEMIS you work on now?
Here at the conference, I'm presenting a paper co-authored with my colleague Jennifer Wu on we're trying to explain when migrants who are settled in Europe decide to help others migrate and when they decide against helping. Because we know that because of the restrictive immigration policies that all of our destination countries have, people who want to come to Europe are extremely dependent on contacts that they already have here, who can help them with information, with documents, with perhaps employment, housing, and so on. And sometimes settled migrants offer that help, and sometimes they don't. And that's decisive for the migration outcome. So we're trying to understand what influences those decisions about helping or not helping.
Did you see particular patterns prevailing looking at the data of when do the migrants, the settled migrants help and when do they not offer help? I'm asking this question particularly in light of our earlier discussion here at the conference during the keynote and the questions of diminutive causation and yes, the ambiguity of the concept itself, but whether your data could shed some light on this discussion.
Yes, what we're doing in this paper, which I think is particularly interesting, is that we actually look at all the 12 migration corridors in the project. So we can compare both across origins and across destinations. And what we've chosen to do is to look at each country of origin separately. So we look at all the Brazilians, all the Ukrainians, and all the Moroccans. And thematically, the thing that we've been the most interested in is whether or not people who have been helped themselves are more inclined to also help others, because that would be a fairly central finding to some of the ideas we've had in the project about migration system dynamics. And we find that it is actually the case especially for Ukrainians and also for Brazilians, that people who have received information about migration possibilities from people who were already at the destination before they migrated, they also become more inclined to help others. So there we have a sort of migration chain pattern where being helped increases people's inclination to help others. With Moroccans, we don't see that pattern. And that's, of course, one of the interesting things we can do in the project, to compare across groups and see, why is this like this in one group and not in the other group. And I think it's not so surprising that for Moroccans, the link between their own migration experience and their current attitudes or behavior is weaker, simply because most of them migrated a long time ago. The average length of stay is much longer for Moroccans than for the other two groups. So of course we control for length of stay of the individual in the analysis, but this link between your own experience and your current behavior is weakened over time. That's what we can assume based on what we see, and that would provide at least part of the explanation why this link between your own experience and your current attitudes is weaker among the Moroccans.
And that again, I think, feeds very well into yet another concept that, it's very old, but also came out a lot during the discussions at the conference, that is looking at migrants as social actors, their strategies, whether to help or not. The time factor has to be brought in.
Absolutely.
We were listening from Paolo Boccagni about the aspirations and the role the time plays there. Indeed, going to the aspirations. This is the area you are most known for and most famous for, as well as the works on involuntary immobility. Do you see there is a potential with all the data available within THEMIS to maybe shed some new light on these concepts, or take them or test them in the context of the data that we have gathered?
Yes, I think what I'm doing right now in this paper actually touches upon that, because one of the causes of involuntary mobility is lack of help from the people who could have helped you migrate. So, for instance, Moroccans, Brazilians, Ukrainians in their country of origin who do have contacts in Western Europe who could help them. For many of them, that would be where they pin their hopes for migration, and if that help doesn't come, that could lead to them being stuck in a situation of involuntary mobility. So that is certainly a potential in the THEMIS data.
Talking about the theoretical developments of THEMIS, we've heard during the first keynote a somewhat of a struggle between Oliver trying to defend the concept, or I would say face it head on and try to incorporate the agency perspective into this, what has been very abstract idea of a migration system, and then Thomas Feist coming in and saying, well, perhaps we should be less ambitious and maybe look at the social mechanisms, which in itself are very interesting. I mean, what are your views as a person who've been centrally involved in setting the theoretical agenda of THEMIS on the concept of migration systems, on its operationalization to the level that we could bridge the theory and the empirical evidence?
I think we're still not convinced by the notion of migration systems as something empirical that we can observe, or that we can say either exists or doesn't exist in specific cases. I think one of the advances that we have made is to focus on the specific mechanisms, and I think we've had a very good interaction between theory and methodology in doing that, and in for instance the questionnaire design, where obviously we had to do a lot of theoretical thinking to find out exactly how can we ask people specific questions that shed light upon the theoretical mechanisms we're interested in. And that process, I think, also improved our theorizing of what exactly is it that we are looking for or looking at. So this focus on mechanisms, and then one idea that was floated at one of our meetings, but which hasn't sort of become part of the external profile, is this idea of systemicity rather than systems. That we're not, we should be wary of reifying the system as a big entity, but we can look for elements of systemicity, which we looked it up, and it actually is a word, and we understand what it refers to, even if we don't use it very often. But that's I think where we're heading, both methodologically and theoretically, that we could look at mechanisms that sort of work in the directions of a system. But then it makes more sense to talk about systemicity as a phenomenon than to talk about a system as a thing.